Every day, thousands of patients depend on doctors to tell them what's wrong. In one hospital in Shanghai, a machine now does part of that work faster than an entire pathology department. Medicine has always relied on one belief. Diagnosing disease takes a trained human mind, built over years, one patient at a time. So how is a machine analyzing more tissue samples in hours than an entire department could process in days? And getting it right? That's the whole story. Not China's AI strategy, not a tech company's ambitions. Just this. How did one of the world's most trusted professions become something a machine could suddenly do instead? Start with what the job actually requires. A doctor doesn't just memorize facts. They take a patient's symptoms, their history, their labs, their scans, and they weigh all of it against everything they've ever learned, everything they've ever seen. That weighing, that judgment, was supposed to be the part a machine couldn't touch. Facts can be looked up. Judgment has to be earned, case by case, over a career. In early 2025, a group of researchers at Stanford put that assumption to the test. They built a benchmark called MedHelm, designed with input from 29 practicing doctors across 14 specialties: cardiology, oncology, pediatrics, neurology. Not a trivia quiz. Scenarios that required reasoning through a case the way a physician would. 9 of the most advanced AI systems in the world were run through it. An open source model out of China, DeepSeek R1, came out ahead of all of them. That result alone would have been a curiosity, a good test score, nothing more. But 3 months later, DeepSeek wasn't sitting in a research paper. It was running inside more than 300 Chinese hospitals, reading real charts on real patients. That's the jump that doesn't make sense. Passing a test is one thing. A hospital handing a machine real clinical work is another. Hospitals don't move fast. They're some of the most cautious institutions in the world, bound by licensing boards, malpractice law, ethics committees that can take years to clear a single new device. So what let 300 hospitals do in weeks what usually takes years? Part of the answer is that the job of doctor was never really one job. It's dozens of smaller tasks stacked together: taking a history, writing it up, reading a scan, cross-checking a drug interaction, flagging what's urgent, following up after the patient goes home. A doctor in a typical hospital spends about 2 hours on paperwork for every 1 hour with a patient. That ratio is the crack the machine slipped through. Nobody had to prove an AI could replace a doctor's judgment on day one. They only had to prove it could take over the parts of the job that were never about judgment in the first place: the transcribing, the sorting, the flagging. At some hospitals, that alone produced numbers that would have sounded implausible a year earlier. Patient follow-up work that used to consume a nurse's entire afternoon compressed into minutes, described by one hospital study as a 40-fold jump in efficiency for that single task. Even the paperwork itself changed shape once the machine took it over. A shift note that used to get written in shorthand, filled in later from memory, now got filed word for word as the conversation happened. Nothing paraphrased, nothing forgotten by the time the doctor got back to their desk. That's a small thing until you multiply it by every patient, every shift, every department for a year straight. At Shanghai's Rujin Hospital, that's exactly what happened first. The AI didn't walk in and start diagnosing patients on its own. It started by listening to doctor-patient conversations and filing the notes automatically. Then, it started reading pathology slides, the 3,000 a day. Then, radiology scans, where turnaround time on a report dropped by roughly 90%, from half an hour down to something close to instant. Each of those steps looked small on its own. A doctor still made the call, but look at what had shifted. The machine was no longer just organizing information. It was the first read on the case, the thing the doctor now checked, rather than the thing that checked the doctor. In early pilot programs at hospitals running this setup, diagnostic errors dropped by roughly 15% compared to the standard workflow. That's not because the machine was smarter than the doctor reading the same file. It's because it never got a case at the end of a 16-hour shift, never had a moment of distraction, never let the 400th slide of the day get less attention than the first. The reason it could keep absorbing more of that work wasn't a single breakthrough. It was repetition. Every transcription, every slide, every flagged lab value fed back into the same system. So the 10th case it handled was read faster and more confidently than the first, and the 1,000th faster still. A human doctor's skill grows over a career of a few thousand cases. This kind of system was accumulating that experience by the week on every shift, in every department at once, which is the actual reason it could take on more of the job than anyone expected, not the size of the machine underneath it. There's a limit buried in that same advantage, though, and it matters. A doctor who's seen something rare once still recognizes it years later because they understood why it mattered, not just what it looked like. A system trained on volume is strongest exactly where the volume is. The common cases, the familiar patterns. The question nobody had fully answered yet was, what happens the first time one of these systems meets something it hasn't seen enough of to be confident about? That's the real turning point, and it's easy to miss because nothing about it looked dramatic. Nobody handed a machine a diploma. The work just kept moving, task by task, from the human side of the room to the machine side, until the machine was doing most of what used to define the job. Within a year, this wasn't one hospital's experiment anymore. It was happening in hundreds of hospitals at once, in cities and in places a specialist would otherwise take days to reach. A patient hundreds of miles from the nearest major city could now get the same first read a doctor in Shanghai was getting. The scale of it is what should stop you. Not the individual numbers, but the fact that the same shift was happening everywhere, simultaneously, without most of the country ever hearing about it. Put that next to what patients elsewhere were dealing with at the exact same moment. Weeks-long waits just to get in front of a specialist, backlogged imaging queues, doctors so buried in charting that the appointment itself felt rushed. And the gap stops being about technology. It becomes a gap in how much of a doctor's attention a patient actually gets. That's the part that travels. It's not the software, it's the math of how many minutes a human being now has left over once the machine has taken the parts of the job that used to eat the day. Even then, you could argue this was still assistance, a tool, a very capable one, but a tool a human doctor was operating. The next step is what makes that argument harder to hold on to. In March 2026, that argument ran out of road entirely. In Hainan, a hospital opened that wasn't built around doctors with AI added in. It was built around AI, with doctors working inside it. Patients uploaded their symptoms before they ever arrived. By the time they walked in, triage was done. A specialist was already assigned, and a case summary already existed. After treatment, the system kept watching without anyone having to schedule a follow-up call. For the first time, the loop that used to require a doctor's attention at every single link, intake, diagnosis, treatment, recovery, ran as one continuous system, and the doctor's role had shrunk to the links that still genuinely needed a human judgment call. So here's the honest answer to the question this video opened with. Doctors didn't become replaceable because a machine learned to think like one. They became replaceable because their job, examined closely enough, turned out to be separable. A stack of distinct tasks, and a machine only needed to be reliable at each task, one at a time, for the stack to shift underneath them. The listening, the reading, the sorting, the follow-up, none of those individually required a medical degree to identify as doctor's work. They just always came bundled with one because there was no other way to get them done at scale. Now there is. That doesn't mean the doctor in the room is gone. But it's worth pausing on how uneasy some doctors themselves are about how fast this happened. A paper published that spring in the Journal of the American Medical Association warned that the rollout was outrunning the safeguards meant to contain it. Not because the model was weak, because it was confident. A system fluent enough to sound right while occasionally being wrong is a harder danger to catch than one that's obviously unreliable, and hundreds of hospitals had already built it into their workflow before every institution had a reliable way to catch that failure mode. That warning didn't stop the rollout. It just marked the line between a machine assisting a doctor and a machine a doctor now has to actively supervise. Every one of these systems still has a physician signing off, still has a human in the loop for anything serious. What's changed isn't that the human disappeared, it's that the amount of the job only a human can do just got a lot smaller than anyone assumed it would. And the part that's left is exactly the part nobody's figured out how to safely hand over yet. At what point did the job stop needing a person for every part of it? That's the question worth sitting with, because it didn't happen all at once, and it didn't ask anyone's permission.